Welcome back to another podcast episode where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. So today we are going to be learning about John's self-taught journey of becoming a developer. I promised you I'd do more of these stories, and we're going to go ahead and follow through with that. So John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is John Mead, and I'm a web developer based out of Utah, just north of Salt Lake. And I'm currently the lead front-end engineer for a company that's based out in Seattle that's focused on improving mental health.
All right, cool. Well, let's just jump into it. What was your job search journey like? I mean, not just a job search, but, what was the learning like, and then the job search as well?
Yeah. So it started back in 2017. Which is when I made a life change by moving from Chicago, where I was at the time, out here to Utah. I was in a bit of a unique situation where I didn't need any other income when I moved here. So I knew I was going to be able to just focus on making the career change that I had wanted to make. So when I moved out here, summer of 2017, I started to kind of take stock of, okay, what is available for self-learning. I knew I didn't have I didn't need the income at that moment, but that doesn't mean I had disposable income to go to a boot camp or something like that. So I knew I needed to do some kind of option that was free or low cost. And so I started putting together resources. And then it was about in 2018, beginning of 2018, that I really started going full bore at it. I started treating it like a job, waking up in the morning, doing learning, going throughout the day, setting clear goals for myself. And I started working through a lot of the typical resources that a self-learner works through. So free code camp, in multiple different iterations that they went through. Code Academy. There were other places like Bento that put together a curriculum. There's a bunch of other sites.
Remind me what Bento was again.
So Bento was basically like they would pick and choose. Are you familiar with the Odin project?
Yes.
Okay, so it's kind of similar where it's like, we're not going to necessarily put together a full curriculum for you, but we know where these resources are. So pick your stack, pick your path, and we'll kind of checkbox you through. Here's a good resource for that. Here's a good resource for that. So a little different than Free Code Camp that just kind of sets everything up for you and you walk through their curriculum. So started doing those resources, and then had another big life change coming up as I started going through a divorce, and knew that I was going to be in a situation again where I was going to need that steady income. And so that's what really prompted me to be like, okay, I'm still feeling a bit like an imposter. I'm not sure that I'm completely ready for this, but I need to be. So I'm going to start applying. So I did. Started applying. I started getting some interest from different companies here in the area. I was just looking here in Salt Lake. First started getting phone calls back, just asking for more information. And then based on those experiences, I slightly refined my process and refined my resume. And then started getting some in-person interviews. And then after that, in 2020, early 2020, I had two different companies, one that was based here in Salt Lake, and then the one I work for now, who I was able to walk all the way through the interview process. There were a couple before that I went to the technicals and, went through up until the technical and then didn't necessarily get a job offer. But I got an offer from a company here in Utah, and then the offer from Listen, the company I'm at right now, based in Seattle. And then I started working for Listen on April 1st, which is kind of funny, starting a new job, April Fool's Day of the year the pandemic hit. So, and I've been there ever since.
Well, I'm glad it wasn't an April Fool's joke. I'm glad you did get the job. Okay. So, I mean, it sounds like, I think you mentioned in the beginning, sounds like you were trying to work out like building habits or like a system or like some sort of like a plan. How did you figure out how to like schedule your day and figure out which direction to go?
So through reading different articles and then looking at where the starting place was for the different free curriculums that were online, I knew, okay, HTML and CSS, I think these might be easier things to start with, so I'm going to start with those. And I had messed with some HTML way back in the day in like junior high, I think lots of us who are self-taught have these memories of just copy and pasting stuff that you find on the internet to try and make your own website. And so I had a little bit of experience there. So I went back to that and I started with HTML. And then I found out that there was, not just divs and stuff, there was a semantic way to write HTML. So I adjusted my goal. I'm like, now I want to know, how do I semantically lay a page out? So I started there, and then I went over to CSS and started applying styling. And then I had done a little bit of language-based work, kind of similar to JavaScript at my previous job, where I was just putting together a custom tracking form in Outlook. And so I was working through some calculations and some if-then statements and basic control flow structure, that kind of stuff. So I knew once I had a grasp of basic HTML, basic CSS, that I had to add this JavaScript piece to it. And so I kind of followed that path. And every time I learned something new, I just started refining. What am I interested in? What came up in this part of their curriculum that's really, really cool, and I want to deep dive on it, and I'd adjust my goal. So.
Okay, so you were paying attention to what really caught your interest. You're paying attention to what made you more curious. So let's say you're going through Free Code Camp, and you're learning some fundamentals, and you learn about a specific concept. You're like, this is really cool. What would you do then to further deep dive into that topic? Where would you look?
And just start Googling the heck out of it. You can find so many resources just on page 1 and 2 of whatever your search is going to be. So I eventually started venturing into Stack Overflow, which was an experience as a new developer, asking a question on Stack Overflow and having it downvoted with no comment. Like, wait, what's going on? But that was my process. It was literally, okay, here's my question. Here's how I think you word it. And now I'm just going to Google and click on everything and see where it leads me. And so based on that, you start to learn what are the things you can count on, right? You learn really quickly about MDN. Okay, I can count on MDN. I know that it's going to point me in the right direction. You can count on the docs for different things. Like eventually later when you get into the frameworks, like you can count on the React docs, right? They're good docs. You can look through. Not all docs are good, but they're going to give you a place that you can go. Is it W3C, WC3? That website, that's not going to point you in the wrong direction. You learn what you can rely on, and then you kind of test things against that. So if you're looking at YouTube tutorials or something like that, you can kind of line them up against the documents and the resources to trust. And if they're in alignment, then you're like, okay, yeah, I think I can go, I can learn more from this person. They seem to be following the standards. So. Okay.
How did you figure out, or how, I guess, what did you use to figure out that you were growing as a software engineer? Because that's like a huge hurdle that self-taught developers, face. They don't really know if they're heading in the right direction. They don't know if they're growing in the right direction. How do you figure that out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you start to figure it out before you realize you're figuring it out. And the first key to that is when you're starting in a new resource and you realize you can skip part of it. So you buy a course off of, I forgot his name when we were talking earlier about Cold Steel. You'll buy a Cold Steel course off of Udemy and realize you can skip the first 3 sections of it because you know it. And so that's kind of a realization point. Hey, I know something about what I'm doing. I'm growing. And then as you learn more resources, as you get into, there's this thing called Code Wars or Leap Code, and you go into the beginner stuff and you realize, hey, I know how to do this. I know how to think through this. Then you take each piece of that and process it and realize you have building blocks in place. And that, for me, that drove me, as I realized I was learning, I wanted to learn more. Like, hey, I can actually make sense of this stuff. This is really cool. Let's keep it up.
I like that.
So.
Okay. So I have a lot of questions. I'm just trying to think about the order that I want to ask them in. What was the project that you felt like really caught employers' attention, or they'd bring it up, you'd talk about it the most?
So there were a couple. One of them was a project I did with a couple other self-taught devs. That was called DevBev.
DevBev.
Which
Okay.
was like a social media site for beverages, basically.
Okay.
We all realized as we were getting to know each other that we all had our preferential drinks, and our workspace was covered in the cans or whatever, So we thought, let's just make this thing where developers can post their beverage and rate it, and it gave you, behind the scenes, it gave you really good practice on how are you going to interact with sharing media and database structures and that kind of stuff. And so we knew that was going to be good learning for us. But that site I talked about at every single interview. It was asked about at every single interview, most likely because I had it at the top of my projects in my resume. But that gave me a good platform to talk to employers about how I worked with a community of developers. Also an ability to talk about how do you problem solve when you hit a wall, individually and as a team. What are things that you think are going to be easy that aren't? So it was just a good talking piece for that. Another one was something I had done, something I had actually designed as a pre-work for an organization called Chingu, and it was basically a clone of Google Fonts. They've changed it quite a bit since then, but it was a basic clone of being able to go in and search the fonts. When you initially go in, you can search for types of fonts, and it's going to show you whatever your sample sentence is, and it's going to show you in each font and how can you adjust the fonts, and using sliders to adjust font size and that kind of stuff. And so that one really gave me the ability to showcase some kind of knowledge about how do you process user interaction on a site. And it doesn't need to be database driven. It can be a static site, but it's still highly interactive. Both of those two projects I was able to talk about at every single interview that I did.
Interesting. Yeah, because I think a lot of people, sometimes they overwhelm themselves with thinking about like their personal projects, their projects that satisfy or solve a problem in their life, or their old industry, but they think their project, it's too immature. Employers aren't going to care about it. And what you're saying is you kind of built a quirky app that dev or drink dev. What was it called?
DevBev. Yeah.
DevBev. Did you ever gain a user base behind it or anything, or was it just for fun?
No. I mean, there was the intention, hey, we could do something with this. But then, as luck would have it, we all got jobs. So you have a little less time to work on the side project. But yeah, what I learned, I think, through the interview process was, there's this drive to come up with this one project that defines you, right? Or this expectation of this one project that defines you. What I talked about most were, other than the DevBev, which was more original, were things that were copies of what was already online. Because that was another way that I was testing myself where I'm at. I would go on and I would say, this is a really cool feature of this website. I wonder if I can build it without looking at the code. And so I'd open up a code pen and build it. And there was a time frame where I would go in and I'd every day pick out a little bit, like a nav bar that had a cool animation. Something that, an animation that did all of the math automatically to figure out how to spread and to spin, and using CSS gradients to, I don't have it sitting here, but I had this MIDI controller. I play a lot of music, and so I had this MIDI controller on my desk one morning, and I thought, hey, can I make this MIDI controller interface in HTML and CSS? And so I did that. And all of those things were building blocks for the conversations that I had during my interviews. So I don't think any employer cared that I didn't have this master project. They cared about little idiosyncrasies. What did you learn from this little piece, this little project that will actually apply to the real world? And that's the important part, in my experience.
I like that. I appreciate you sharing that. Let's see, what do I want to ask? I feel like, so I kind of want to sum this up just a little bit, make sure I understand it. But it feels like it feels like you got comfortable with just building projects that might not even matter. Like you said, you had this MIDI controller and you just want to rebuild it and put it in HTML, which is, sure, maybe you could apply it to some applications that you might work at companies, but the goal really was just to see if you could do it and give yourself that challenge. And so all these little challenges that you kept giving yourself, you mentioned they're like building blocks to kind of just you growing as a developer and being able to talk about that growth and that implementation to developers. So you're highlighting something I really want to emphasize here, though. You're saying that, and this was interesting, you don't need a grand project to be super impressive to employers. You're saying that the employers that you talk to didn't really care about that. That's not what they were looking for. They were kind of just looking for your process of growth, the way you implemented certain things, the way you thought about certain things, and you didn't need this grand masterpiece, which I'm wondering if that's what's causing a lot of self-taught developers to give up. I feel like a lot of self-taught developers, they have this imposter syndrome. They're never good enough. They're perfectionists. I think a lot of self-taught developers have a hard time getting over that perfectionism. And what you're suggesting is stop that. Just work on these projects that make you curious and allow them to allow you to grow. Because, eventually it's kind of just like trust the process. You're eventually going to be able to build more complex projects. You're going to recognize you could skip halfway through tutorials and you just need targeted education to solve that specific feature that you're trying to build. And maybe that's kind of the key for a lot of self-taught developers. It's stop overwhelming yourself with trying to develop this perfect project that's going to make you stand out.
Yeah, and you think about it, once you've gone through the interview process, what gets you one step further in the interview? It's not really the project. You go to the technical interview, they're not going to test you on the technical stuff of your one big project, right? They're going to give you a very specific problem. Most of the time that relates to something they do in the job. And so it doesn't matter where you got that ability to complete that problem from. As long as you can complete it, you're golden. So it's the skill employers are after. It's not, I should say, there's a million ways you can go about getting that skill, right? But it's the skill that the employers are after.
I like that.
Spot on.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's interesting to think about it that way. Well, let me ask you this, because the way you described it, it feels like you had this almost like sequential path, and you were able to analyze what you previously did and just slowly improve and solidify that path going forward. But did you have any like really frustrating moments or moments where you felt like maybe I can't do this?
Oh, yeah. Let me try and think of a couple. In Free Code Camp, when I got to this first list of, 100 or whatever JavaScript algorithms that they have you work through, and I'm just like one after the other, hours every day, and feeling like, every one is harder, which it technically was. As you go down, it gets harder and harder. But feeling that I wasn't having a simpler time processing it at the start than I did the previous algorithm, that was really frustrating. And those algorithm lists actually led to quite a few times of saying, okay, I'm going to take a week off. I can't do this. This is not mentally sound for me to keep doing right now. So then I'd come back to it. Another one was regex, which still, unless you're using it every day, whenever you have to reach for it again, you have to go back and figure it out again, right? There's some basics that you kind of keep in your head. But I remember the first time I did a regex challenge, and I was like, what is the, I don't understand this. I don't know what's going on. So those are two examples. And then anytime, so I like math. I'm not very good at it, but I like it. And so when you get to some of those veins of development that are more like machine learning-esque or data processing, that kind of stuff, and as I'd be stepping through different projects step by step, there were times when I would catch myself and I'd realize, I'm just doing this because step 5 says you should do this. I have no understanding of what the heck is happening though. And so those times were really, really frustrating. And it was hard for me to learn that I had to stop and go on to something else and come back. And that's just the way my brain handled it. I can't pummel through the problem. I had to stop, take a break, go do something else, maybe go do a different project for a couple days, and then come back to it. But those moments were really, really frustrating.
I don't think I remember anything about regex. I really don't. I've looked that up.
One of the first things I had to do when I started the position I'm in right now was do some checking for file types in an upload. And, if you're writing semantic HTML, it gives you some controls over that as well. But I started with regex, and I was like, man, I had finally mastered this. I did all the regex stuff on Free Code Camp and wherever over here, I got that done. I didn't remember any of it.
You're hardly the only one.
No, I wouldn't imagine.
I like that. Because a lot of developers stress themselves out over trying to remember things. And I think that's a wrong way to think about your growth. I like that you emphasize that. So I guess you kind of touched on it a little bit, but a huge challenge is, and the big question is, what do I build? What do I build that employers are going to care about? And how do I figure out what I even enjoy building? Like, for those that are just struggling to come up with project ideas, what would your advice be for them?
My advice would be just get on a browser and go to the websites that you frequent. You already know you like the content. There's probably something cool about the design within the context of the content that you already have a connection to. And just pick different pieces of that website and build it. Build a nav bar, build an image carousel, or there's some variation of all of that on most sites. The background has some really cool SVG path stuff. Do some SVG paths and figure it out. Look for what you like to ingest as content and use that. Just build it. And if you feel like riffing on it, riff on it, but use it as your starting point. And pretty soon, at least in my case, I found that I was covering each of the major building blocks of what a website is or what a web application is.
What's riffed? Riffed on it mean?
If you riff on something, it's like you're taking the original and you're trying to do something unique to it. So, like in music, you could. This classic song might be these 4 chords, but you're gonna riff on it. You're gonna make it your own. You're gonna add a 7th over here to add some texture or something like that.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, I really like that. I feel like a lot of developers just need to build stuff. I feel like they don't need to build a perfect thing. They just need to build a thing.
Yes.
They need to build another thing and another thing. And I feel like for me, it just kind of, I got more comfortable with coming up with ideas of what I wanted to build because I knew what I enjoyed. And then I started figuring out, man, I really love the front end. So that's where my focus went. You can't know that stuff because so many people are like trying to build the perfect path before they even get started. And with the self-taught, it just feels like it has to be solidified along the way. And you have to analyze that. You have to figure out what you do. You have to kind of listen to yourself and get curious and pay attention to what really has your attention. I guess I'm really just trying to dig into this because so many self-taught developers give up. Why do you think that is?
It is a massive world. Web development is huge. You can specialize in one tiny little piece of it and have a great career. But I think, and this is me included, when I started, I was like, I have to ingest everything. I have to build something. I've gotten to the point where I've decided I want to do front end. Okay, I have to learn React like the back of my hand. I have to learn Angular. I have to do a project in Vue. What I do right now is none of those 3. I work in kind of a home-rolled framework that is pure JavaScript. And so knowing those 3 things, in my case, didn't even necessarily pay off. Will it in the future? Most likely. But the fact that I have the foundational skills of what those frameworks are built on or those libraries are built on, that's what's going to pay off for me in the end. And that's one of the reasons I got the position that I'm in right now. And so I think the sooner a self-taught developer can figure out that they don't need to learn everything, they just need to figure out what their interest is and dive deep into that interest. And somewhere, especially now, as we're hopefully coming up on the end of the pandemic, when stuff has really, really shifted to remote work, and I think it will remain that way, you're not bound by your community anymore. You can really, and this is really true of tech, pandemic or not, but you are not bound by your community and what's available to you. If you want to specialize in WebSockets, then there's a company who is going to hire you for WebSockets. And that doesn't mean you're going to do that your entire life. You might find something else at that company that you like and grow into it. And somewhere down the road, might be managing and not writing any code. You'll just be managing coders. And that's completely fine. But the sooner you can learn as a self-taught person that you don't need to know everything, I think you free yourself up from being pulled in a million different directions. Because if you allow yourself to be pulled in those million different directions, you're going to drown, right? You're going to burn out. You're going to start again. You're going to burn out again. And it won't go anywhere.
I think you nailed it with that. I feel like a lot of self-taught developers do feel like they're overwhelmed because they are pulled in all these different directions.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, that's good advice. Well, I feel like we've gotten a good feel of your story. I do. I guess I'm just going to ask this one last question. If you had to give one final piece for aspiring developers, what would it be?
I think it would be a take on what I just said. It's a wide world in development. So find what you like and pursue that. Because just like any other job, if you get into something that you're not passionate about, even within the realm of front end or back end or whatever, it's going to burn you out and you're not going to enjoy it. So, give yourself enough credit and give yourself enough self-love to realize you can figure out what you like and you can go after that and let that be your passion.
I like that. Give yourself enough credit and self-love. I've never heard that before. I like it. That you can, okay. All right. Well, yeah, this is really good advice. I feel like I feel like you're someone that does a really good job of analyzing your past and learning from it. And that's really, I think, part of the success of being a self-taught developer and what's going to get you through. So yeah, you did a really good job of just like really elaborating on all this. So we're at the end of the podcast. If people want to reach out to you, where could they reach you?
The best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. I'm not very active on the other socials at the moment. So you can find me, John Mead. The company is Listen.io on LinkedIn.
Okay. All right. Well, John, I really appreciate you coming on. We're going to end the podcast in a second, but I forgot to tell you afterwards. Stick around. But for everyone watching, if you want to see more of these interviews, like I said, I want to bring on more self-taught developers. They're all unique. They're all interesting. And I feel like we could really start honing in on some common patterns that really gets everyone through, because a lot of self-taught developers struggle with that. Their journey is so unique. They don't really know what stories should resonate with them, what they should look for in those stories that they can adapt into their own personal style or how to analyze themselves. So let's keep digging into these. But John, like I said, stick around for a couple minutes, but thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be here.